Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hello and kia ora to all our New Zealand colleagues that might be joining us today. Thank you for joining us for this ADCET webinar, the LGBTIQ plus inclusive practices for people with disability. My name is Darren Britton and my pronouns are he, him. I am the National Assistive Technology Project Officer with the National Disability Coordination Officer Program and part of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, that is ADCET for short. This webinar is being live captioned by Michelle from Bradley Reporting. To activate the captions, click the CC button or locate that on your toolbar. It's either at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. We also have captions available via your browser, and Jane will put that into the chat box now for those that wish to access that. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne, Victoria, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today and acknowledge their ongoing commitment and connection to country, land and sea. Before we begin, just a couple of minor housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on the ADCET website in the coming days. Throughout this presentation, feel free to use the chat box, so chat with each other and with us, but please remember to choose everyone so that everyone can see what you say. If you have any questions you would like to ask of any of our presenters today, please use the Q&A box to do that. If you have any technical difficulties, please email admin@adcet.edu.au. Very excited as part of Pride Month that today's webinar we have Dr. Lynn Jarvis, the Chief Executive Officer of Working It Out, Tasmania's diverse gender, sex and sexuality support service and education provider, and Anna Pike, a guest speaker with lived experience, who's an intersectional community activist in both the LGBTIQ plus and disability spaces. Thank you both for joining us for this presentation today, and I'll hand over to you, Lynn.
Oh, thanks, Darren. It's great to be here. And I'm coming to you today from the land of the Ngunnawal people in the southeast nation of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and also pay my respects to the Aboriginal people who are the Aboriginal custodians of this land and acknowledge their ongoing fight for justice. So just as a background for anybody who's visually impaired, I'm a 60-plus-year-old female. I'm wearing a black jacket and a white shirt with some colourful flamingos on it, pink flamingos, and behind me is a couple of posters on the wall. I'm not a person with disability, although I do identify as a lesbian. However, the information that I'm talking about today is information that comes directly from research into the lives of LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, or from our own consultation process that we did in 2020 as part of developing an e-learning resource for disability sector workers. And we'll hear from Anna a bit later in the presentation. We had a bit of trouble with our slides, so Kylie's going to drive the slides for me. So next, thanks, Kylie. Okay, we're just going to start with a little bit of background, and I would like to acknowledge that many of you might understand this stuff, but it's always good just to go through some basics, because what we often find is people aren't quite as au fait as they think they might be. The LGBTIQ plus acronym is a bit of a problem. It gets bigger and, you know, variations of it, and it's hard to say. I acknowledge that. I'm plugging for diverse sexuality, bodies and gender as an alternative, but it hasn't got there yet. I'm going to talk very broadly about a few identities here, but if there's some that you want to know more about, please just put a question in the Q&A section, and hopefully I can provide you some information or links to that later on. One thing I would like to talk about, and this is sometimes people get a bit confused, is there's actually three kind of key differences in that acronym. There's some words that describe people's sexuality, and that's like lesbian, which is women who are attracted to women. We have the word gay, which in this acronym means gay men. It can also mean gay women, but you know, in this it means gay men, and bisexual, which are people who may be attracted to either sex. So they may have a male partner or a female partner. And that's about people's sexuality, which is different to people's gender identity. So I'm a cisgendered female. So that cisgendered means that I identify with the sex that I was assigned at birth. And that term cisgendered sits in opposition to the term transgender or trans and gender diverse, which means that people have transitioned from the sex they were assigned at birth to a gender identity that they feel is their authentic selves. A transgender man is a person who was assigned female at birth and has transitioned to be a man, and a transgender woman is a person who was assigned male at birth and has transitioned to be a woman. So sometimes people confuse sexuality and gender, but they are different things. Obviously, a transgender people can be heterosexual, they can be homosexual, they can be bisexual, lesbian, gay, and so on. The other one there is intersex, which is a really little known about community. Intersex people have innate characteristics that do not sit at either end of the binary of sex. It is not completely male or not completely female. They exist somewhere in the middle there. It is not seen as a different sex in itself. So most intersex people would see themselves as male or female, but acknowledge that they have some variations of sex characteristics as well. And of course, intersex people are not transgender people and should never be confused as such. The letter Q in the acronym can stand for lots of things, but commonly it's queer. Queer is a term that has had an interesting history. It was originally seen as a very abusive, but like some other terms that we've got, has been reclaimed by members of the community and now is used quite commonly and quite proudly, and particularly amongst younger people. Some older people can still feel very traumatised and offended by the word, however, so it's something to be used a bit with caution. And Q can sometimes mean questioning. The plus is used commonly to accommodate a lot of other identities. The non-binary, which is people who don't identify as either male or female. Pansexual, which is again a broader understanding of sexuality. People are attracted to people, not particular male or female. Asexual is a group of people that don't typically feel sexual attraction to anybody. But there's lots and lots of stuff in there that can be explored. My advice to people is when you hear something new you don't understand or you're not familiar with, like I do in my job all the time, I just go to Google and have a bit of a look and find out what it is. It's not that hard. Sometimes I find people seem to get stuck when you come across language that they don't understand. It's like they haven't got any capacity to go and find out what that means themselves, but I assure you that you have. Next, thanks, Kylie. Just a couple of words about identity. And if you just take like a few seconds to have a think to yourself about any time that you might have felt that you were invisible, that you have been discriminated against, or even if you've just been left out. So just take a couple of seconds to have a think about any such experience. We do this exercise a lot in our training, and we find that many people have had those experiences. Some people say they never have, so lucky them, but a lot of people have in very different ways. And what we understand when we think about this is that it doesn't feel great to be left out, to be discriminated against, or to be invisible, that we all like to be seen. And identity is one way of us being seen. So some people criticise what they call identity politics, which is, where people try to find a language and perhaps a label that suits them. And, there can be new language and new labels emerging all the time because people are always searching for their space, their group, and to be seen. Not everybody likes those labels, not everybody wants to use them, but for those that do, I think they can be very useful. And identities can also be used to help us activate, to advocate for rights. Next, thanks, Kylie. So this is a short video. Hopefully Kylie can make this one play.
I'm Michaela Moody. I'm a 28-year-old disfigured trans queer woman. For me, it felt like I could only have one thing, and that had to be my disfigurement and disability. And that was what ran through my head when I was 13 and thinking it would actually be really nice to be a woman. But at that point I thought, I can't, because I've already run that well dry of care and sympathy, and I can't just choose something else. So I ignored it for 10 years and then until I couldn't. My social dysphoria can be pretty bad because there's obviously the expectations that come with being trans of, you know, certain ways that bodies present, that faces present, but then I have the extra added bonus of being disfigured, of having this face which is different. Sometimes it feels like there's nothing I can do. I'm still going to be read as a guy. I'm glad that I am a disfigured trans gay woman. I have a wonderful partner who is amazingly supportive. She's fantastic. I want the people who are abled, who are neurotypical, who don't experience chronic pain or chronic fatigue, who are straight size thin, who are not disfigured, who are LGBTQ+, to be seeing us more and listening to us more, and realizing that we're not so scary, but also realizing that, you know, we deserve our place in the broader community.
And what Michaela was talking about there, something I'll talk about a little bit shortly, is that sometimes people, LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, can struggle to fit in both mainstream society, but also LGBTIQ plus communities. So we're very fortunate in Australia. We've had some great pieces of research done in the last few years that are very extensive, a very large scale. Private Lives 3, which looks at the experience of LGBTIQ plus people over the age of 18, and Writing Themselves In 4, which looks at the experience of younger people. And I really would encourage people to have a look at both these studies. They're amazing. There's so much in them. But in both of these have sections on the experience of LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities. So in Private Lives 3, it's section 15, and in Writing Themselves 4, it's section 16. So again, I'd just like to take a moment to ask you to reflect and think about what do you imagine the percentage of LGBTIQ plus people with disability or long-term health condition is? What percentage do you think it is of the general LGBTIQ plus community? And then have a think about whether this is more or below or above or the same as the national average, and why that might be so. And feel free to put your reflections in the chat. I'm not expecting right answers here, by the way. Okay, then I see somebody's doing their research. So I'll let you know that it is nearly 40% of the LGBTIQ plus population do identify as having a disability or a long-term health condition. And that's compared to 17.7% of the general population. So there's a lot more people in the LGBTIQ plus communities that experience disabilities than the broader population. And the next slide, thanks, Kylie. So we can see here that obviously, like everybody, there's a broad diversity of disabilities and long-term health conditions that people experience, but chief amongst those are mental illness and psychological distress. And I think it's important to put that, particularly the mental health statistic, in a context. And Kylie, if you can show the next slide. Maybe next one, sorry. Yeah, that one. Okay, so what this one tells us, and this is only verbal harassment, but what we know is that LGBTIQ plus people in general, and particularly LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, continue to experience high rates of verbal abuse, of harassment, assault, and exclusion. And this is the underlying cause of significant psychological distress within the communities. So we can see here that within the last 12 months, 52% of the respondents, people with LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, had experienced verbal harassment, and 71% had a lifetime experience of having verbal harassment. So yeah, that's really important to keep in mind, and why we need to create spaces that are inclusive and safe for people. Next slide, Kylie. That ongoing, those ongoing experiences create very high levels of psychological distress for people. So we can see here that with oh, sorry, it's hard, I can't see my own thing. There, sorry. People without any LGBTIQ folk without any long disability or long-term health condition have already a very high level of psychological distress, so high, very high, at about 41.7%. But when we go right over to the other side of the right-hand side of the screen, and we can see people with severe disability, for example, we're getting up to nearly 86.4% of that population feeling extremely stressed or distressed. And so I think that's really important to think about when you're perhaps have students who are LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, is that they have, quite likely to be experiencing high levels of distress. Just for comparison, the general Australian population is 13.3%. So you can see the very huge, the large disparity between those two figures. LGBTIQ plus community members also have very high rates of suicide ideation and suicidality, unfortunately. Next slide, Kylie. One of the findings in the Writing Themselves In report, in fact, is that LGBTIQ plus people under 25 often felt unsafe and uncomfortable in their education setting due to their gender or sexuality. So, and this is, so more people with disabilities experience this at a higher rate than people without disabilities. So, what I wouldn't like to do, though, is to paint the LGBTIQ plus people as a community that is just about, statistics and psychological distress. Because in fact, if you've got somebody, LGBTIQ plus person with a disability in your educational institution, that means they're a pretty amazing person, showing considerable resilience and strength to overcome many of the obstacles that stand in their way. So I always like to go from a strengths-based perspective. It's important to know what issues people face, but that doesn't define them, and we need to see these people as really great resources in our learning institutions. And we have one such lovely person here today with us, is Anna. So I'm going to invite Anna now to come and chat to us. Anna is an LGBTIQ plus identifying person with a disability, and Anna is currently studying a certificate in community services at TAFE. Okay, I'll turn my screen off for a minute and we'll hear from Anna.
Thank you, Lynn. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar. My name is Anna Pike and my pronouns she, her. For a visual representation, I am a cisgender woman with blonde hair that is up in a ponytail. I'm wearing all black, sitting in a wheelchair, and I have rainbow dangly earrings. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Muwina people, the traditional custodians of the land that I am on today in Nipaluna, Hobart. And acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I was asked to come here today to talk a little bit about my experience within the education system, being both a disabled person who is also part of the LGBTIQ plus community, and what systems are currently in place and what could be done better for future students. My experiences have been mixed. I have experienced being a student back when I was walking and had not come out yet, and my current experience with being a wheelchair user. While the culture on campus is one of inclusion, I find that it is mainly driven by a very small group within the Rainbow Action Group, which unfortunately means there are gaps. And what I mean by that is intersectionality is something that is missing, which means that people that are from more than one background, for example, someone disabled and queer, we don't see ourselves reflected within the system. Having the chance to work in a supportive and inclusive environment makes a big difference in our experiences as students. as it means that we can just focus on our studies and not have to worry about being discriminated against or face any kind of prejudice in relation to our identities. In turn, this makes us feel welcome and that we belong. Making changes doesn't have to be a very big thing. It just be little things that can go a big way to feeling included. For example, seeing a poster on a notice board of a disabled person in a same-sex relationship or at a pride parade. Diversity training is currently offered in both the community services course and as a standalone training course. The problem, however, is that it is not mandatory. So time and time again, you just see the same groups volunteering to participate, which is great. However, they aren't really the target audience. I believe if we provide more training and visibility to marginalised communities, that will go a long way to educate the public and help build understanding and close gaps. Thank you very much for having me today, and I will pass back on to Lynn.
Fabulous. Thank you, Anna. It's always great to hear from people who are in the environments that we're talking about. And I think, you know, that point, which I'm sure people on this webinar already understand, that being able to bring your whole self to your learning experience not only supports that person to be more successful in the learning environment, but it also means that they had a lot to give to other people without them becoming always the person that has to explain everything. But their life experience would no doubt help in any kind of work that they're undertaking. Great, and hopefully at the end, if people have some questions for Anna, they can ask them then. Thanks, Kylie. Next slide. Okay, maybe just press enter again. So I didn't realise there was a timing on that one. Okay, so this one is what I've called the Magic 5, and it's just really 5 simple things that can be done to help people feel included and safe. And I was just listening to another short video early on this morning that was being made, and it was talking about LGBTI inclusion in sport. And one of the recipients, people interviewed there, was just saying you can never underestimate the importance of some sign of safety, because LGBTIQ plus people in general, I'm sure people with disability and LGBTIQ plus people with disability particularly, are always looking for signals that an environment is safe for them. Next, Kylie. So a simple thing that people can do in their educational institutions, and I know many universities and probably TAFEs around the country have ally networks or pride networks, so they're great for having symbols, posters. Obviously, I'm working it out here with some of our posters that we have. Simple things like lanyards, a sticker on your door. They are really simple ways of saying you're safe here and you will be respected. Obviously, it's important that this is backed up in reality. So having signs and signals without any of the other practices can be a bit problematic, but just as a very simple first step, signs of safety are important. Another easy thing for people to do is to put a little rainbow flag on their email signature, if they're comfortable doing that, or even including their pronouns in their email signature. Next, Kylie. So wherever possible, it's great to use inclusive language, and that goes beyond LGBTIQ plus folk, but using gender neutral language is great because it doesn't make assumptions about people's gender. So police officer rather than policeman, and I think we're all getting better at that. Don't make assumptions about people's heterosexuality or being cisgendered. So, for example, look, as I said, I'm a lesbian. I think I look like a lesbian, but the number of times people have talked to me about my husband, just making assumptions that I'm somehow married to a man, is really off-putting. And then, I'm put in the situation of thinking, well, do I correct them or do I just go along with it? How do I negotiate this situation? So just being really mindful of using, perhaps not making assumptions about heterosexual relationships. But it is kind of evolving, because I'm married to my wife, and I recently had an experience where I introduced somebody as my wife, and then the person I introduced them to kept talking about my partner. And so that was like also not acceptable, because I had clearly used the word wife, and that's how I saw our relationship. and that was then not sort of honoured by using the word partner. So I get it, it can be a bit complex, but it's good to think about these things. As I said before, it's important not to confuse sexuality, gender, and intersex. They're different parts of a person. Different people might have combinations of all those things, but they're not the same. And it's really good to make sure that you understand what some of those differences are. Anna, I put my pronouns in on the title on my video thing there, and Anna gave her pronouns, which I should have done, but I forgot, when she introduced herself, which is fantastic. So signaling your pronouns is a really simple way sometimes of identifying your gender, and also allowing space for people who perhaps don't identify with the gender that they maybe look like, or you're not sure about, they can signal that too. Next slide, Kylie. So one way to do that is to be proactive. You might say, hi, I'm Alex Smith. My pronouns are she or her, or they or them, or he or him, example. And you could ask, what pronouns do you use? I would recommend not to say prefer, because for people who are using pronouns, we don't prefer those pronouns. They are our pronouns. And if you make a mistake, then you just quickly apologise. Don't make a big thing of it, because that then becomes about you and the mistake. Yeah, so she said, sorry, he said, is just get on with it and don't sort of stop. One of the things, sometimes people talk about the they, them pronoun, which is a common set of pronouns used for non-binary people, but there are other alternatives as well, which I won't go into here, but they, them is common for that community. And, you know, some people have trouble with that because they think that they, them is only used to refer to plurals or more than one person. But we actually do commonly use they, them in our language to mean one person. For example, oh, this person left their bag at the shop. I wonder if they're going to come back and get it. So we tend to use they and them when we don't really know who the person is. So we've just, non-binary people have kind of just extended that current usage to say, well, we know who the person is, but their gender is not one or the other. It's not in that binary space. So, yeah, if you can start practicing using they, them pronouns, it can take a little while to use them correctly, but as I say, practice makes perfect. We all make mistakes. I find people in the trans and gender diverse community extremely forgiving, and they appreciate where people try. And when we make a mistake, I always try to own up to it and just keep going. Okay, so we've talked about signalling safety. We've talked about using inclusive language. And, you know, I could present probably 2 or 3 days worth of information on this stuff. So really, these are just headlines that I hope people can go back to and do a bit more research about. Next slide, thanks, Kylie. So it's really important that we have inclusive systems and processes. And this can include things such as forms, it can include things such as policies, and it can include things such as facilities. So what I've got here are a few screenshots of some ways that we could ask about people's gender and in a form, for example. One of the things I always talk about is just to think about whether we need to collect anybody's sex or gender. Sometimes it happens automatically and you think, why the hell do they need to know whether I'm a female or a male or something else? So that's always the first question to ask. But where you do need to ask it, it's good to be thinking about what is appropriate. So the only problem that I can see here with these is that the word gender, intersex isn't a gender, so I wouldn't actually be using any of those in the getting there or pretty good thing boxes. What I really encourage everybody to do is to refer to the 2020 ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics Standards for sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation. It's quite a comprehensive document, and that document has been created with the assistance of the LGBTIQ plus community. LGBTIQ plus Health Australia, in fact, helped formulate those questions. And the idea is to try and implement a standard set of questions so that data can be collected and compared across different areas and sectors. So yes, inclusive forms. Not only do we need a way for people to identify themselves accurately in forms, but we need a way for people to be able to change their forms if, for example, they need to, particularly in the case of trans and gender diverse people. There is nothing more distressing for trans and gender, well, I wouldn't say nothing more, but you know, it's extremely distressing for trans and gender diverse people to be misgendered, to be called the wrong name, to have the wrong pronouns attached to them, and not to be acknowledged and seen as the person they are. So having processes and institutions where people can make those changes is really, really important. And that often is reflected in policies that those institutions might have to drive the change in practices, so ensuring that it's inclusive. Facilities can be important. You know, most of us don't have male and female toilets in our houses, but somehow we've created a world where they are divided into male and female toilets in public. And yes, it can be important that those facilities are safe, but we need to ensure that people in the trans and gender communities feel safe as well. There's a very high rate of urinary tract infections amongst transgender people because they avoid using bathrooms commonly, and so till they're at home, and so that's really problematic for people. So, you know, single cubicles are great where they're neither male nor female, they're just a toilet. Other options include gender neutral toilet facilities that everybody can use. So if we want to be inclusive, and of course we need to be inclusive of people with disabilities, well, whether it be mobility disabilities or others as well. So I think we've got a long way to go to making toilets accessible for everybody. But when institutions, for example, are renovating or rebuilding or creating new facilities, I think there's not much excuse now for not thinking through these particular things. Inclusion policies can include stuff like transition leave for trans people, trans staff, or accommodating perhaps transition in some of the learning plans that students might have. So looking at different ways that people's diversity can be accommodated. Thanks, Kylie. All right, so this one here is about affirm, celebrate, include. For a long time we talked about, you know, I think even one of the politicians said in this last horrendous election, horrendous if you're LGBTIQ+, that is, because of the rhetoric that was public around trans people. But I think somebody said we're more tolerant than that. And I guess a lot of people, and probably many people in this webinar, would challenge that word tolerant. Tolerant is a very low bar. It means, well, okay, you can be here and we'll put up with you. So we champion affirmation and celebration. So it's not just that we have to make spaces for people who may be LGBTIQ+ or LGBTIQ+ people with disabilities. We want to actively and proudly acknowledge that they're there. So if an institution does something to be inclusive, then they should shout it from the rooftops, not hide it away and just said, oh, we quietly changed these things, so, you know, to be more inclusive. They should be shouting it out. They should be shouting out the lives of LGBTIQ+ people with disability, and in the way that many other lives are shouted out about and are acknowledged. So that can include including people in curricula, I think, is really important. So they're not there because they're LGBTIQ+ person with a disability. They're there because they're a human being and they're part of the diversity of humanity. So I think a lot of case studies, for example, could just include people from diverse backgrounds without making any particular mention of them. They're just there, we get along, that's somebody's life. And I think that's a really simple way for educators in particular to be inclusive and make other people feel inclusive. We can go to the more celebratory side of things. You know, there's we've got Pride Month at the moment, a bit of a North American import from my point of view, but I think I have to rest my case on that one and just go with it because it's out there. Doing things for Pride Month is, you know, something else we can do. Participating in local Pride parades is great. having days that acknowledge different identities is fantastic as well. So there's lots of things that we can do to make sure that we're really celebrating the lives of the diverse lives of people and their various identities. Oh, I think I've gone from 5 to 6, Kylie. Kylie, next slide. Yeah, sorry about that, folks. I think I've gone 4 to 5. This should be number 5, not number 6. Anyway, it's a great one, so maybe it needs 2 numbers. This one, I guess, I'm you know, probably if people are in this room, I'm sure they're already respectful and probably doesn't maybe apply to them, but it's really something that came out very strongly in our consultation with LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, particularly around the services that they might get through care workers and NDAs and so forth. And that was that about, you know, being respectful and thinking about what you would and wouldn't find acceptable as a human being. Now, I remember I worked in the university for a number of years, and one very senior colleague of mine, you know, basically wanted to ask me about my sex life and how lesbians had sex. And I kind of couldn't be disrespectful, but I wanted to be, and I felt like they will go and Google it and find out. But I couldn't do that. But that was a kind of intrusive and totally unnecessary question that I got. And I know that people, you know, particularly transgender people whose bodies they may or may not have changed. Not everybody does go through medical transition, but a lot of transgender folk get very intrusive questions about their bodies. I know people with disabilities also get very intrusive questions about their bodies, about how their bodies work, about how they have sex, how they relate to other people. So it's just a really strong reminder about just that basic element of respect in our relationships with LGBTIQ plus people with disability. My dad was a great one, sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but he always felt that his curiosity was the permission for him to ask intrusive questions. And I did challenge him on this a number of times, but I sadly couldn't get him to change his mind. But that idea, and I'm curious about lots of people. I want everybody to have all their information on their forehead so I can learn about them. But that's not, you know, that's just my thing. I have to keep that to myself. So I think it's really important to understand that our curiosity is not a mandate to ask questions of other people. And kind of on that point too, I think, you know, it's really great to learn about diverse people and their experiences, but we can't rely on them always being there to educate us. We have to take some responsibility for doing that research. And if you've got an LGBTIQ plus person in your course or at your institution, you can talk to them about how much they might like to share, but don't expect that they're there to educate other people. That's not their job. Their job is to learn so other people can be doing that work. Of course, there's a range, you know, one of the things, and we saw this in the election, there's a range, LGBTIQ plus people's lives are still highly moralised and highly politicised. And, you know, people from faith-based backgrounds, not all of them, many of them are fantastic, but there are some faith-based views that do not support inclusion of LGBTIQ plus people. And my call, I guess, to educators and others is that people are not ever being asked to change what they think or what they believe, but you may be asked to change what you do. I know discrimination laws vary in different states. In Tasmania, for example, it is illegal to discriminate against anybody on the basis of their gender, sexuality, or their disability. So it's not only, it's illegal to do those things, as well as very unhelpful and unsupportive. So just keeping in mind, you know, and sometimes with your students, perhaps, depending on the kind of course that they're doing, sometimes how to negotiate those religious or political views can be really quite tricky and difficult. And finishing on that, really with this election just gone by, where the lives of trans people were once again made a political sort of football, I can only say that has done such tremendous damage to the lives of trans and gender diverse people that it's really going to be hard to recover from that. Even with the same-sex marriage postal survey, we know that causes significant rise in distress amongst the LGBTIQ plus communities. And I know that these latest public debates will also have a tremendous effect. So I guess this doesn't just relate to LGBTIQ plus people with disabilities, it's probably broader than that. But if your institution is ever in a space where it gets into these public debates, I would really hope that people stand up and say, that's not acceptable. Yeah, and that's really creates great harm. Thanks, Kylie. Next one. And just sort of kind of lastly, I'd like to finish off with a note about history, because again, recently I did a radio interview in Darwin for Wear It Purple Day, which is a day for young people. And the first thing that the interviewer said was, oh, well, isn't it all fine now? You know, what are we worrying about? And I had to say, well, no, it's not fine. We started from a very low bar, and so things have improved, but there's still high rates of discrimination, abuse, harassment, and so forth experienced by LGBTIQ plus people. There's still high rates of stigma as well. And whilst same-sex marriage was great and allowed some of us to get married and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't bury the significant scars of past trauma and discrimination and legal processes. For example, Tasmania was the last state to decriminalise homosexuality in 1998. So that means that there's many people alive today who would have grown up when being gay was illegal or cross-dressing was illegal. I know personally many people who have been exited from their families, who've been exited from faith-based institution, who have even had their children taken from them or have been assaulted, physically assaulted. So when we're dealing with LGBTIQ plus people in general, and I imagine this is when we talk about any generalised statistics, we know it's generally worse when people add in that intersectional disability or any other intersectional identity. We know it gets worse. So understand that the people that you're talking to, even some of the younger people, might have had significant experiences. And so that notion that everything's fine now, it does reflect that things are getting better, which is fantastic, but it doesn't reflect the fact that not everybody's life is better, and that for many people, they still carry around the legacy of the past. And what this can mean sometimes is that people sometimes are hyper-vigilant, which can look like service avoidance, or it can look like they're overreacting to something or maybe super sensitive to something. So if you're seeing behaviours like that, stop and have a think about, well, I wonder what's driving that. What is it about the experience of this person that has led them to take up this position? So yeah, look, I guess that's kind of a bit of a less than positive note to finish on, I guess. But I would like to say that, you know, it's great that things are improving. We have fantastic webinars like this where fantastic people come along and want to learn more and do better. And I would just like to say thank you to everybody for doing that and coming along today. And hopefully I've given you a few pointers, very brief, very high level, but hopefully you've got some pointers that you can go away and continue, really encourage you to continue to do your own research and to learn more about this space. And now I finished pretty much on time and we've got some time for questions.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Lynn and Anna, for your presentations there. I think that was very inspiring. There's lots of hearts and applause and thumbs up rolling across the screen, as there was during several of the slides when you were talking today. We do have a couple of questions that have come through there. One, and I was curious as well, where can we get and buy those wonderful posters you've got in the background that you're sharing, Lynn?
So you can, we don't charge for them, but we do charge postage if we've got to send them somewhere. So the general one, which is this one, it just says difference, something to celebrate. You can just send an email to info@workingitout.org.au. I think we're nearly out, so there might be a bit of a wait where we've got to order some more in. The other one here is specifically referring to, oh no, it's a different one. Oh, that's actually just my nephew's artwork. Sorry, can't get that one. That one's mine.
You're not auctioning off your nephews.
Oh no, I can't attach him though. It would be very tough.
Excellent. We'll make sure we get the address up onto the website as well. So if people do want to contact about those posters, then please do.
Yeah.
Another question here. Yes, and we also are you able to provide a link? Is there such a link to the 5 magic steps to safety? I think.
No, but I think this PowerPoint will be shared.
Yep.
So hopefully you can, just that's the link, I guess, to doing that. I don't have anything else. I think, you know, those. So as I said at the start, this presentation was based a bit about some research that is out there, but also partly on the consultation that we did with LGBTIQ plus people with disability around Tasmania about what they wanted from disability services workers. So from that, we had a small grant from the Pride Foundation, and we created an e-learning resource, which is really targeted at disability sector workers. And it's really trying to give those workers some practical strategies. But it also does it through storytelling, so telling the story of people rather than doing this kind of presentation where I'm giving you facts and figures and information. Our e-learning for disability sector workers is really telling people stories and not sort of, and then hopefully sort of learning by osmosis. And that's where we came up with some of these just really simple steps, like the 5 magic steps that I had there are pretty much based on that. So yeah, I think it's a really good way to start, to have just a few simple things in your mind that you can do.
Yep, and you've also, with WIO, have some other online training around disability and the LGBTIQ.
Well, that's the one I'm talking.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about, and I think you're going to share that. So that as I said, that one is targeted at LGBTIQ plus folk with disabilities and disability sector workers. So, you know, if anybody's here, I know TesTape, for example, have bought that to have available for all their students in their community services and disability services courses, which is fantastic. So for anybody else here who works in that sector, that might be interest of them to them, and details will be provided as part of the resources for this webinar.
Yep. There was a question on the use of they, them, but I think that one's been answered. And another question, what is the rainbow tick on the bottom of the WIO website?
Okay, so the rainbow tick is a national quality accreditation. So if people know about, there's lots of quality standards in higher education and health service and so forth. And so there's been one created for LGBTIQ plus inclusion, which is called Rainbow Tick. It's run by Rainbow Health Australia, which runs out of La Trobe University. So what that is, it's quite an extensive process. So we're Rainbow Tick accredited, which you might think, well, of course you are. But even for an organisation like us, it was quite good to go through and make sure we hadn't missed anything. But what it does is it goes through a number of standards, which helps organisations make sure that they're covering all their bases. So, I mean, there's 2 ways you can go with a Rainbow Tick. You can go for accreditation, which, you know, is great, and I would encourage everybody to do that. Sometimes that is difficult, though, particularly with larger institutions. It can be expensive and very complex. The other thing you can do is perhaps do a Rainbow Tick course. It's called How To course. So that's how to apply for the Rainbow Tick. But if you actually did the How To course, you could really get an in-depth understanding of how to make sure your service was inclusive. So I guess I'm just plugging that you don't always have to go the whole accreditation process. There's a step in between if you found that wasn't for you, that would really help embed inclusive practices in your particular institution.
Excellent. And there's just another question around the posters again that are on your website and things, but we'll make sure that we put all of those links up onto the website. Once again, I'd just like to say thank you, Lynn, and thank you very much, Anna, for your lived experience and sharing it today with everybody. I thought that was fantastic. And just before we finish, just like to say that we'll put a link into chat for our upcoming webinar on July 7th, which is on leveraging students' voices to strengthen student support. The webinars that ADCET delivers often come directly from suggestions and feedback from practitioners, much like the one today, from across the sector, and it'd be absolutely fabulous if you could take a minute or 2 to complete a short survey, which will be put into chat for people to do today. We really do value your feedback, and it does help us on planning future sessions that are relevant to the sector. Once again, thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, Anna, for today. I think, yeah, highly enlightened. You can see from chat, there's a lot of love in the room for what was given out today. So thank you for that. Thank you to Michelle from Bradley reporting, and Jane and Kylie in the background for wrangling and making sure all these things happen. Although we did have a few little technical issues, I think it went rather well. Thank you for everybody coming along today and participating, and thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.